Why does your daughter look exactly like me? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended mid-fall, 32 floors above the city, in a boardroom that smelled of Italian leather and fresh orchids. A woman who had never known uncertainty found herself completely frozen. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the glass conference table so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her breath had stopped somewhere in her chest and refused to move. She was staring at a child, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing near the doorway in a faded blue dress that was slightly too large for her small frame. The child clutched a crumpled piece of paper against her chest like it was a shield protecting her from the strange new world she had stumbled into. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Her shoes were scuffed. Her backpack had seen better days. But her eyes, those amber eyes, flecked with gold in the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, were staring back with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. And they were identical, absolutely, impossibly identical to the eyes of the woman who had just spoken. The same unusual shade, the same almond shape, the same slight upturn at the corners. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected 30 years into the past. The CEO's voice cut through the silence again, sharper this time, edged with something that might have been fear disguised as authority. I asked you a question. Why does your daughter look exactly like me? The man standing beside the child shifted his weight. He was tall but weathered, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into bones visible in every line of his face. His work boots looked out of place on the pristine marble floor. His hands were calloused, his jacket patched at the elbows, and there was a dignity in his posture that had nothing to do with money or status. He placed one protective hand on the girl's shoulder. His eyes met the CEO's without flinching, and what he said next would unravel 8 years of buried secrets. It would shatter the carefully constructed walls around a billion-dollar empire. It would force everyone in that room to confront a truth that none of them were prepared to face. But more than that, it would prove something that most people spend their whole lives trying to understand. That family has nothing to do with blood. That love is not something you inherit, but something you choose. And that sometimes the most broken roads lead us exactly where we were always meant to be. The answer he gave would change 3 lives forever. But before I tell you what he said, before we dive into this incredible story of secrets, sacrifice, and second chances, I need you to do something for me. Take a moment right now to hit that like button. It tells me that stories like this matter to you, and it helps more people find the kind of content that reminds us all what really counts in this life. And if you believe that love defines family more than blood ever could, drop the word family in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know if this message resonates with you the way it resonates with me. Now, let me take you back to where this impossible moment actually began. Let me introduce you to the man standing in that boardroom, the single father whose simple, honest answer would rewrite 3 destinies forever. His name was Marcus Webb. At 41 years old, Marcus had learned to measure his life not in achievements or acquisitions, but in small moments of survival stitched together by love. He worked double shifts at a warehouse on the edge of the city, his hands permanently calloused from lifting boxes that weighed more than his own tired body wanted to carry. His back ached most mornings before he even got out of bed. His knees cracked when he climbed stairs. He had forgotten what it felt like to wake up without exhaustion already waiting for him. But none of that mattered. None of it had mattered for 8 years, because 8 years ago, Marcus Webb had been given a reason to keep going. A reason that stood beside him now in her faded blue dress, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his, her curious amber eyes taking in the impossible luxury of this glass tower they had somehow wandered into. Her name was Grace, and she was his daughter in every way that mattered. Marcus had never imagined stepping into a skyscraper like this one. The polished marble floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers. The air carried hints of expensive perfume and fresh flowers arranged in vases that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, and every person who walked past wore clothing that screamed wealth in that quiet, confident way that only true money can achieve. It felt like another world. A world where people made decisions that shaped markets and economies, where single phone calls could build or destroy entire companies, where power was measured in zeros on bank statements and names on buildings. Marcus did not belong here. He knew that. His work boots left faint marks on floors that were probably cleaned by people who earned even less than he did. His patched jacket drew glances from assistants in designer suits. His weathered face and tired eyes told a story that had no place in boardrooms or executive suites. But he had come anyway. He had come because Grace had entered an art competition. Because her school had announced that the city's largest corporation was sponsoring a contest for young artists. Because the winner would receive a scholarship personally funded by the CEO herself. And because Grace, his Grace, loved to draw more than almost anything else in the world. Her pictures were always full of warmth. Houses glowing under golden sunsets. Fields of flowers swaying in imaginary breezes. Fathers holding daughters' hands while walking toward distant horizons. There was hope in every stroke of her crayons, optimism in every color she chose, a belief in goodness that Marcus sometimes envied because his own faith in the world had been tested so many times. He had encouraged her to enter the competition, even though the ceremony would be held at the corporate headquarters itself. Even though he knew walking into that building would feel like trespassing. Even though some part of him had always feared that Grace's other life, the life that existed before him, might somehow reach out and try to reclaim her. That fear had lived in his chest for 8 years. And now, standing in this glass tower with a powerful woman demanding answers he had never expected to give, that fear was finally coming true. But to understand why, you need to know what happened 8 years ago. You need to know the night that changed everything. The night Marcus Webb found his daughter and lost his loneliness forever. It was January. Bitter, brutal January. The kind of cold that seeps through every layer of clothing and settles into your bones like a permanent resident. Snow had been falling since morning, thick white flakes that covered the city in a blanket that looked beautiful from warm windows but felt like punishment to anyone stuck outside in it. Marcus was walking home, not by choice, by necessity. Bus fare was a luxury he could not afford that week, not after paying for the medication he needed for the cough that had lingered since November, not after making sure the electricity stayed on for another month. So he walked, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air, his shoulders hunched against the wind, his feet numb inside boots that had long since stopped being waterproof. He was coming from his third job of the day. Mornings meant newspaper delivery, hauling bundles of papers to corner stores and coffee shops before the sun came up. Afternoons meant the warehouse, 8 hours of lifting and sorting and loading, until his muscles screamed for rest they would not receive. Evenings meant dishwashing at a diner 3 blocks from his apartment, scrubbing plates in water so hot it left his hands red and raw, but at least the kitchen was warm and sometimes they let him take home leftover soup. 3 jobs, 7 days a week, just to survive. And even then, survival was all he could manage. There was no saving, no future planning, no dreams beyond making it to the next paycheck. Life had become a treadmill that he could not step off, each day blending into the next in an endless gray blur of exhaustion and obligation. 18 months earlier, everything had been different. 18 months earlier, Marcus had been a man with hope. He had been married to a woman named Josephine who laughed like music and believed in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. They had been trying to start a family, talking about baby names and painting nurseries and all the beautiful ordinary things that couples in love talk about when they imagine their future. Then the diagnosis came. Cancer. Advanced. Aggressive. 6 months if they were lucky. They were not lucky. Josephine held on for 4 months before the disease took her, leaving Marcus alone in an apartment that suddenly felt like a tomb, surrounded by memories he could not escape and a future he no longer wanted to face. Grief hollowed him out. It carved away everything soft and hopeful and left only the hard edges of a man going through the motions because stopping felt like betrayal. Josephine had believed. In living, in fighting, in squeezing every drop of meaning from every single day. To give up would be to dishonor everything she had taught him. So, he worked. He filled every waking hour with tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He walked through the world like a ghost, present but not truly alive, surviving without actually living. That was who Marcus Webb was on that January night, a ghost made of grief and exhaustion, walking home through falling snow, wanting nothing more than to crawl into bed and forget that another day had passed without her. He was passing the old bus station on Fletcher Avenue when he heard it. A sound so faint it could have been the wind, could have been a stray cat, could have been his imagination playing tricks on a mind blurred by fatigue. But something made him stop. Something made him turn toward the narrow alley that ran alongside the station's service entrance. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was Josephine somehow, somewhere, nudging him toward a moment that would change everything. He stood at the mouth of the alley, snowflakes catching in his eyelashes, his breath clouding the frozen air. The sound came again, higher this time, more urgent, a cry. A baby's cry. Marcus moved before his mind caught up with his body. He stumbled into the alley, his boots slipping on ice-covered pavement, his eyes scanning the shadows for the source of that impossible sound. Behind a dumpster overflowing with trash bags, half buried in snow that was still falling, he found it. A cardboard box. His hands trembled as he lifted the flap. His heart stopped beating for 3 full seconds when he saw what was inside. A baby. Tiny, impossibly tiny, wrapped in a hospital blanket that had soaked through with melted snow. Her lips were blue. Her fists were clenched against the cold, fighting even though she had no idea what she was fighting against. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and the cry that escaped her throat was weak, so weak, like a candle flame about to go out. She could not have been more than 3 days old. 3 days old and already abandoned, already forgotten, already left to die in the cold by someone who was supposed to protect her. Marcus did not think. He did not weigh options or consider consequences or wonder what this would mean for his already impossible life. He simply acted on instinct, on something deeper than logic, on a love that had no name but demanded everything from him anyway. He tore off his own coat and wrapped it around her, pressing her tiny frozen body against his chest, trying to share what little warmth he had left. He started running, not walking, not jogging, running, his tired legs finding strength they should not have possessed, his lungs burning in the frozen air, his heart pounding with a terror he had never known before. 4 blocks to the emergency room, the longest 4 blocks of his life. He burst through the hospital doors looking like a madman, wild-eyed and desperate, shouting for help before the automatic doors had even finished opening. Nurses rushed toward him. Doctors appeared from nowhere. Hands reached for the bundle in his arms, and for one terrible moment, he did not want to let go. But he did. He let them take her because they could save her, and he could not. And then he collapsed into a plastic chair in the waiting room and did something he had not done since Josephine's funeral. He prayed. Hours passed. 1 hour, 2, 5, 10, 16 hours in total. Marcus sitting in that waiting room, ignoring every suggestion that he go home and get rest, refusing to leave until he knew she was okay. Finally, a nurse with kind eyes came to find him. "She's stable," the nurse said. "It's a miracle, honestly. Another hour out there and she wouldn't have made it. But she's a fighter. She's going to be okay." Marcus felt tears streaming down his face and did not bother to wipe them away. "Can I see her?" The nurse hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She led him through sterile corridors that smelled of antiseptic and something else, something that might have been hope, until they reached a room where a tiny figure lay in a plastic bassinet surrounded by monitors and tubes and machines that beeped in steady rhythms. She was pink now. Her lips were no longer blue. Her breathing was even and strong. And when Marcus approached, when his shadow fell across her face, her eyes opened. Amber eyes, flecked with gold, looking up at him with an expression that seemed far too wise for a baby who had barely been alive for 3 days. He reached down without thinking, letting his finger drift toward her tiny hand. Her fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength, holding on like she already knew. Like she already understood that this stranger had saved her life. Like she had already chosen him. Something shifted inside Marcus in that moment. Something fundamental, something irreversible. The emptiness that had lived in his chest since Josephine's death suddenly felt a little smaller. The future that had seemed pointless suddenly had a shape, a purpose, a reason. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know where she had come from. He didn't know who had abandoned her or why. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he was not going to abandon her again. The police came, of course. They asked questions, took statements, launched an investigation. Detectives searched for the mother, for the father, for any relative who might claim this tiny life that had nearly ended in a cardboard box behind a bus station. They found nothing. No missing persons reports matched. No hospitals reported a mother who had given birth and then disappeared. No families came forward searching for a lost child. It was as if she had materialized from nowhere, as if the universe had simply created her out of snow and desperation and dropped her into the arms of a man who desperately needed something to live for. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation grew cold. Social services grew impatient. There were forms to file, procedures to follow, a system that had no patience for miracles or mysteries. They called her baby Doe in the hospital records. Unnamed, unclaimed, unknown. She was scheduled to be transferred to a group foster home, one of those overcrowded facilities where children became numbers and numbers became statistics. Marcus learned about it on a Thursday afternoon, and by Friday morning, he had made the boldest decision of his life. He was going to adopt her. The process was not easy. Nothing in his life had ever been easy. He liquidated what little remained of his savings. He sold Josephine's jewelry, the rings and necklaces and earrings that he had sworn to keep forever, letting go of the past so he could grab hold of the future. He hired a lawyer who believed in impossible causes, a woman who saw something in his eyes that convinced her to take the case for a fraction of her usual fee. 14 months. 14 months of paperwork and home visits and interviews and background checks and court appearances. 14 months of proving to a system designed to discourage single fathers that he was capable of providing a loving home. 14 months of fighting for a child who had no one else to fight for her. And finally, on a Tuesday morning that felt like a celebration, a judge signed the papers that made it official. She was no longer Baby Doe. She was Grace. He chose the name carefully, deliberately. Grace because that is what she was. Grace because that is what she had given him. Undeserved, unexpected, transformative grace that had reached into the darkest chapter of his life and pulled him back toward the light. Raising her alone was never easy. Money remained perpetually short. There were nights when Marcus skipped meals so Grace could have fruit in her lunchbox. Mornings when he claimed he had already eaten breakfast so she could have the last of the cereal. Winters came and went, and he learned to pretend he was not cold so she could have the thicker blanket, so she could wear the warmer coat while he made do with layers that barely kept out the chill. He learned skills he never expected to learn. How to braid hair by watching tutorials on his phone at 2 a.m. after she had fallen asleep. How to soothe nightmares with made-up stories about brave little girls who conquered monsters. How to answer questions about where she came from when she was old enough to start asking. Because she did ask. As she grew, Grace noticed things. She noticed that she looked nothing like her father. She noticed that other children had baby pictures with their mothers, while her earliest photos showed a man with tired eyes holding her in a hospital room. She noticed, with the quiet intelligence that Marcus had recognized in her from the very beginning, that her story was different. And Marcus always told her the truth, as much truth as he knew anyway. "I don't know where you came from, sweetheart," he would say, holding her close, breathing in the scent of the strawberry shampoo she loved so much. "I don't know who your first parents were or why they couldn't keep you, but I know where you belong, right here with me. You're my daughter, Grace, not because of blood but because of love, and love is stronger than anything else in this whole wide world." She accepted this with a wisdom that constantly surprised him. Other children might have felt angry or cheated, might have demanded answers that no one could provide. But Grace seemed to understand, even at 6 years old, even at 7, that family was not about where you started. It was about where you ended up. To Marcus, she was never someone else's child. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. Blood was never what made them family. Choice did. Sacrifice did. Showing up every single day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, that's what made them father and daughter. But there was something he had never told her. Something he had kept locked in a small wooden box at the back of his closet, a secret he had carried for 8 years without knowing what it meant. A silver bracelet, delicate, expensive-looking, clearly out of place with everything else that had been in that cardboard box on that frozen January night. It had been tucked beneath the soaked hospital blanket, pressed against Grace's tiny chest, almost as if someone had wanted it to stay hidden. Engraved on the inside of the bracelet was a single letter. E. Marcus had never known what it meant. He had shown it to the police, of course, but it had led nowhere. No matching jewelry had been reported missing. No engraver remembered creating it. It was just a letter, a mystery, a question that had no answer. He kept it anyway, not as a clue, because he had given up on clues years ago. He kept it as a reminder that Grace's story had started before him. That somewhere out there, someone had placed that bracelet with her before letting her go. That maybe, in some broken way, someone had loved her before he did. He never expected the bracelet to mean anything. He certainly never expected to find himself standing in a glass boardroom, facing down one of the most powerful women in the city, about to learn that the letter E had an answer after all. Can we just pause here for a moment? I need you to really think about what we've just witnessed. A man who had nothing, a man who was drowning in grief and exhaustion and loneliness, stumbled across a dying baby on the worst night of his life. And instead of walking away, instead of calling someone else to handle it, instead of treating it as someone else's problem, he chose to become her father. He gave up everything he had left of his past to secure her future. He learned to braid hair at 2 a.m. He skipped meals so she could eat. He showed up every single day for 8 years without expecting anything in return except the chance to love her. If that story is hitting different for you right now, if you're feeling something in your chest that wasn't there before, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button, not for me, but for every Marcus out there. Every single parent fighting invisible battles. Every person who chose love when giving up would have been so much easier. And if you know someone who needs to hear that real fathers are made, not born, share this video with them. Send it to someone who has earned the title through sacrifice instead of just DNA. Drop a heart in the comments if Marcus reminds you of someone in your own life. Someone who raised you with that kind of devotion. Someone who chose you when they didn't have to. Because what happens next, what Marcus is about to discover about the woman standing across from him in that boardroom, it changes everything. Now let me tell you about Vivian Hartwell. Let me show you that even the most powerful people can carry the deepest wounds. At 35 years old, Vivian Hartwell was one of the most successful business leaders in the country. Magazine covers featured her face. Business schools studied her strategies. Competitors feared her reputation. She had taken a struggling family company that was hemorrhaging money and transformed it into a billion-dollar empire through sheer force of intelligence, discipline, and relentless determination. She was known for her brilliance, known for her ice-cold composure in negotiations that left opponents feeling outmaneuvered before they even realized what had happened. Known for a surgical precision in decision-making that seemed almost inhuman in its consistency. People admired her. They also feared her. Very few actually knew her. Behind the power suits in the corner office and the commanding presence that could silence a room just by entering it, Vivian Hartwell was profoundly, desperately alone. She had built walls around herself so high and so thick that even she could no longer see over them. Her penthouse apartment occupied the top floor of the city's most exclusive building, filled with expensive art and designer furniture and views that stretched to the horizon. Every surface gleamed. Every detail was perfect. And the silence that filled those immaculate rooms at 3 a.m. was the kind of silence that could drive a person mad. She had awards on shelves that meant nothing when she couldn't sleep. She had a contact list full of names that would mean nothing if she called them crying at midnight. She had everything that was supposed to matter and absolutely nothing that actually did. And she had nightmares. Every few weeks, sometimes more often, she would wake gasping in the darkness, reaching for something that wasn't there. The echo of a baby's cry still ringing in her ears. The dream was always the same. A tiny hand reaching for her. A door closing. A scream building in her throat that never quite escaped. She had never told anyone about those dreams. She had never explained to the succession of therapists she had briefly employed why she really needed their help. Some wounds are too deep for explanations. Some griefs are too complicated for strangers to understand. People saw Vivian Hartwell as untouchable. They saw designer suits and commanding presence, and a woman who had conquered every obstacle the business world could throw at her. But they didn't see what she saw every time she closed her eyes. They didn't see the 11 minutes that haunted her. 8 years ago, Vivian Hartwell had been a different woman entirely. She was 27, brilliant and ambitious, but suffocating beneath expectations she had never learned to question. Her father ran Hartwell Industries with an iron grip, grooming her from childhood to eventually take his place. Her mother moved through society events like a ghost, more concerned with appearances than emotions. Vivian had grown up learning that feelings were weaknesses, that vulnerability was failure, that the only path to worthiness was success. She excelled at everything expected of her. Top of her class at an Ivy League business school, fast-tracked through the company ranks, respected by colleagues twice her age. Every achievement was another brick in the fortress her parents had been building around her since birth. But inside that fortress, Vivian was suffocating. She felt like a prisoner in a life someone else had designed. She performed the role of dutiful daughter and future CEO without ever asking if it was what she wanted. She dated men her parents approved of, attended events her mother scheduled, suppressed every impulse that didn't fit the mold she was expected to fill. Until she met Adrian. They crossed paths at a charity gala, the kind of glittering event Vivian attended out of obligation rather than interest. She was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne she didn't want, calculating how many more minutes of small talk she needed to endure before she could reasonably escape. And then he was there. Tall, slightly disheveled, with paint permanently staining his fingernails and ideas that challenged everything her structured life represented. He was a sculptor, passionate and unconventional, the kind of man who saw beauty in broken things and meaning in moments others ignored. He didn't know who she was, or if he did, he didn't care. He talked to her like a person instead of a future inheritance, asked her questions about her thoughts instead of her family's portfolio, laughed at things that actually were funny instead of things that were strategically amusing. For 6 breathless months, Vivian lived 2 lives. By day, she was the Hartwell heir, performing her duties with the precision expected of her. By night, she was just Vivian, anonymous and alive, exploring parts of the city she had never seen, discovering passions she had never allowed herself to feel, falling in love with a man who seemed to see the real her hiding beneath all the layers of expectation. Adrian made her feel free. He made her feel seen. He made her believe that there was a version of her life where she got to choose her own path, instead of walking the one that had been laid out before she was born. When she discovered she was pregnant, 2 opposite forces collided inside her, terror and joy in equal measure, fighting for dominance in a heart that had never learned to trust its own emotions. She imagined telling her parents, imagined their disappointment, their anger, the scandal that would inevitably follow. She imagined walking away from Hartwell Industries, from the expectations, from everything she had been raised to become. She imagined freedom. But when she told Adrian, when she watched his face as the words sank in, everything changed. He disappeared within a week. No forwarding address, no explanation, just a note left on her pillow in handwriting that suddenly seemed childish instead of artistic. "I'm sorry, Viv. I wasn't built for this kind of prison. You'll be better off without me. Please don't try to find me." Prison. He had called it a prison. The life growing inside her, the family they could have built together, the future she had dared to imagine for the first time in her entire existence, he had called it a prison. And he had run away like she was the warden instead of the woman who loved him. Vivian was alone. Pregnant, terrified, ashamed, and utterly alone. Her parents could never know. The scandal would be catastrophic, not just for her reputation but for the family company, for the carefully cultivated image that had taken generations to build. Her mother would never look at her the same way. Her father would see her as a failure, as damaged goods, as proof that he had invested in the wrong heir. She couldn't face that. She wasn't strong enough. Not yet. So when Helena Croft appeared with solutions, Vivian listened. Helena had been her mother's closest friend for decades. She had been present at Vivian's birth, at every birthday party, at her graduation and her first day of work, and 100 other milestones. She was family without being blood, trusted without question, a fixture in Vivian's life who had always seemed to have her best interests at heart. "I can help you," Helena said, her voice gentle and confident in a way that made Vivian want to believe her. "I know people, discreet people. There's a facility outside the city, completely private, completely confidential. You can have the baby there, and we'll arrange an adoption with a wonderful family. No one needs to know. Your future stays intact. Everyone wins." It sounded reasonable. It sounded kind. It sounded like the only path forward that didn't end in destruction. Vivian was 27 years old, drowning in hormones and heartbreak and fear. She was not thinking clearly. She was not asking the questions she should have asked. She trusted Helena, and that trust would cost her everything. The facility was exactly as Helena had described. Discreet and clean and populated by professionals who asked no questions and offered no judgments. Vivian spent the last 3 months of her pregnancy there, hidden from the world, telling her parents she was overseeing a European expansion that required extended travel. When the baby came, she was ready to sign the papers, ready to walk away, ready to bury this chapter and pretend it never happened. Then they placed her daughter in her arms, and everything Vivian thought she knew about herself shattered into pieces. She was so small, so perfect, 10 fingers and 10 toes, and a shock of dark hair that was impossibly soft against Vivian's cheek. Her eyes were closed at first, but when they opened, when those amber irises focused on Vivian's face with an intensity that seemed far too aware for a newborn, something primal and irreversible awakened in her heart. This was her daughter, her child, the most important person she had ever met. 11 minutes. That was how long they let her hold her. 11 minutes of memorizing every feature, every tiny expression, every flutter of those delicate eyelashes. 11 minutes of inhaling that newborn scent and feeling that tiny heartbeat against her chest and knowing with sudden terrible clarity that she could not go through with this. She couldn't give her away. She couldn't let someone else raise the only pure and real thing she'd ever created. But when she tried to speak, when she tried to tell Helena that she had changed her mind, the words came too late. "I'm sorry, Vivian. Helena's voice was brisk, businesslike, utterly devoid of the warmth it had carried before. "The family is already here. The papers have been filed. Everything has been arranged. I changed my mind. I want to keep her. Well, that's not possible." Helena cut her off smoothly. "The agreement was clear. You signed documents, Vivian, legal documents. Any attempt to reverse this now would create exactly the scandal we worked so hard to prevent. I don't care about the scandal. I want my daughter. Think of your father. Think of everything he's built. Would you really sacrifice all of that for a moment of hormonal sentimentality?" They took the baby while Vivian was still too weak to stand. They took her while tears streamed down her face and her arms reached for something that was already gone. They took her and closed the door and left Vivian alone in a sterile white room with nothing but the ghost of her daughter's weight against her chest. She screamed. She begged. She threatened. None of it mattered. Helena had planned for everything. The papers were airtight. The facility had protocols. By the time Vivian gathered the strength to fight, her daughter had already vanished into a system designed to hide children from the people who loved them. The adoption was sealed. The records were closed. And Helena reminded Vivian, with a coldness that revealed her true nature for the first time, that any attempt to unseal them would result in revelations that would destroy not only Vivian, but everyone who shared the Hartwell name. "Go home," Helena said. "Grieve if you must, but then move on. Focus on your future. This was a detour, nothing more. The path ahead remains clear." Vivian went home. She did not grieve. She did not move on. She began to search, quietly at first, using what few resources she had access to. Then more aggressively, hiring private investigators, legal teams, anyone who claimed they could pierce the veil of sealed records and closed adoptions. She spent fortunes. She followed leads. She chased shadows across the country, across continents, anywhere that whispered promises of answers. But Helena had been thorough. Whatever she had done with that baby, whatever family had supposedly adopted her, the trail was impossible to follow. Every lead ended in dead ends. Every promising clue evaporated into nothing. 3 months after the adoption, Vivian's father died of a heart attack. The doctors blamed his heart. Vivian blamed grief, though she would never say so out loud. She inherited everything: the company, the responsibility, the crushing weight of expectation. She threw herself into work with the desperation of someone running from demons. She grew the company. She expanded into new markets. She became the success her father had always wanted, the heir her mother had always demanded, the CEO that magazine covers celebrated. And somewhere beneath all those achievements, the hollow space in her chest continued to ache. Helena Croft died 2 years later. Stroke, sudden and unexpected, taking all her secrets to the grave. The facility where Vivian had given birth closed shortly after, all records conveniently lost in a fire that the authorities ruled accidental. Every door had closed. Every path had ended. Vivian resigned herself to never knowing what had become of the daughter she had held for 11 minutes and lost forever. She built an empire to fill the void where her daughter should have been. But empires don't laugh. They don't call you mommy. They don't fall asleep in your arms. And every night, in the silence of her penthouse, Vivian Hartwell faced the truth that all her billions couldn't buy back 11 minutes. 8 years. For 8 years she had carried this weight. Had smiled for cameras while screaming inside. Had made decisions worth millions while replaying 11 minutes in her memory. Had become powerful enough to command boardrooms while remaining utterly powerless to find one small girl. Then one morning, her assistant reminded her about the children's art competition. It was a routine corporate sponsorship, the kind of community engagement event that generated positive press coverage and tax benefits. Vivian had approved the funding months ago without much thought. Now she was expected to appear at the ceremony, to present the scholarship, to smile for photographs with talented young artists who represented the company's commitment to education. She almost canceled. There was always real work to do, deals to negotiate, fires to put out. But something stopped her. Call it fate. Call it instinct. Call it the universe, finally deciding that 8 years was long enough. Vivian Hartwell walked into the hall where the children's artwork was displayed, and her entire world changed. The paintings lined both walls of the gallery, colorful and chaotic and beautiful in the way that only children's art can be. Vivian moved through them with the distracted politeness of someone fulfilling an obligation, nodding at each piece without really seeing it, until she saw one painting that stopped her cold. It showed a little girl standing between two worlds. One side of the canvas was dark, shadowed, filled with shapes that might have been tears or rain or falling stars. The other side was bright, golden, warm with sunlight that seemed to radiate actual heat. The girl in the painting stood exactly in the middle, her back to the viewer, her dark hair flowing behind her like a river. She was holding hands with two figures. On the dark side, a shadowy presence that looked protective despite its obscured features. On the bright side, a figure made of light, reaching toward her with arms that seemed to promise safety. At the bottom of the painting, in the uneven handwriting of a child still learning how letters work, were four simple words. Love makes us family. Vivian felt her chest constrict. She felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack at the edges. And then she turned and saw them. A man and a girl standing near the edge of the gallery. The man was clearly uncomfortable, his work boots and patched jacket marking him as someone who did not belong in this corporate setting. His hand rested protectively on the shoulder of a child in a faded blue dress. The child was maybe 7 or 8 years old, dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders. Amber eyes flecked with gold in the afternoon light. Amber eyes that were identical to the ones staring out from every mirror Vivian had ever faced. Time stopped. Or perhaps it didn't stop so much as fold in on itself. 8 years collapsing into a single moment of recognition that hit Vivian like a physical blow. The shape of the face. The small birthmark near the collarbone, barely visible above the dress's neckline. The way her brow furrowed when she was concentrating on something. Every feature, every detail, everything that Vivian had memorized in 11 minutes and then lost forever. This was her daughter. This had to be her daughter. But how was she here, in this gallery, standing beside a man who clearly was not wealthy enough to be part of any adoptive family Helena would have chosen? The question escaped before Vivian could stop it, tearing itself from her throat with the desperation she had spent 8 years learning to hide. Why does your daughter look exactly like me? I need to stop here for a second because this moment, this right here, is why I tell these stories. Think about what we're witnessing. Two people who should never have met, brought together by a child's painting and a corporation's charity event and a million tiny coincidences that somehow aligned perfectly. A woman who spent 8 years searching. A man who spent 8 years protecting. And between them, a child who has no idea that her entire identity is about to shift. If you're feeling the weight of this story, if you're rooting for all three of them, you're not alone. That's the power of a story that touches on something universal. The need to belong. The need to know where we came from. The need to be chosen. Hit that like button if you're feeling it. That like is how you tell me this story matters. And if you know someone who needs to hear that mistakes don't have to be forever, share this story with them. Send it to someone who might be carrying guilt from a decision they made years ago. Send it to someone who might need to know that redemption is always possible. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were Marcus right now? Would you protect your daughter at all costs? Would you let this stranger into her life? What would you do? Because what these two decide to do next, it goes against everything you might expect. And it's beautiful. Now let me show you what happened when the truth finally came out. The conference room had cleared. Assistants and executives had been ushered out. The door closed firmly behind them, leaving only 3 people in a space designed to hold 20. The city sprawled far below them through floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding above it. Vivian stood at one end of the glass table. Marcus stood at the other, and between them, Grace looked back and forth with an expression that carried too much understanding for a child her age. "Grace, sweetheart." Marcus's voice was gentle, the same tone he used when soothing nightmares. "Why don't you wait in the lobby? The nice lady at the desk said she has some crayons." "But Daddy..." "Just for a few minutes, I promise. I'll come get you soon." Grace hesitated. Her amber eyes, those impossible amber eyes, darted between her father and the strange, powerful woman who hadn't stopped staring at her. Something was happening, something important, and she was old enough to sense it even if she couldn't name it. But she trusted her father. She always had. "Okay," she said finally. And then she slipped out of the conference room, the door clicking softly behind her, leaving the adults alone with truths neither of them was fully prepared to face. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Then Vivian spoke, and her voice held none of the commanding authority that had built her empire. It was small, fragile, the voice of a woman standing at the edge of everything she had been trying not to hope for. "Tell me everything. Please, I need to know." So Marcus told her. He told her about the January night and the bitter cold, about the cardboard box behind the bus station and the baby whose lips were turning blue. about the desperate run to the hospital and the 16-hour vigil in the waiting room, and the moment when tiny fingers wrapped around his and something inside him shifted forever. He told her about the failed investigation and the sealed records, about the months of fighting the system and the lawyer who believed in impossible causes, about selling his late wife's jewelry and liquidating his savings and spending 14 months proving that a single father with calloused hands and an aching back could provide a loving home. He told her about the silver bracelet engraved with the letter E. When he said that, Vivian made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a sob. She reached up and touched her throat, her collarbone, the place where a silver chain usually rested beneath her clothing. "I had a matching one made," she whispered. "For her, E for Evelyn. That was going to be her name, after my grandmother." Marcus nodded slowly. "I always wondered what it meant. I kept it. It's in a box at home. I never knew if it meant something or if it was just random, but I kept it anyway." "Why?" The question seemed to confuse him. "Because it was hers, because it came with her, because even if I didn't know the story, I knew there was one, and she deserved to have all the pieces of herself, even the ones I couldn't understand." Vivian felt something crack inside her, not breaking exactly, more like ice finally melting after a long and brutal winter. She was supposed to go to a family, she heard herself say, the words spilling out before she could stop them. A good family, that's what Helena told me. Private adoption, sealed records, perfect parents who would give her everything I couldn't. I believed her. I was 27 and scared and alone, and I believed every word she said. Her voice broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, the first tears she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know she was abandoned. I could never. I've spent 8 years searching. 8 years trying to find out what happened to her. Every lead went nowhere. Every door was closed. Helena covered her tracks so well that I started to wonder if my daughter had ever existed at all." Marcus watched her crumble, this powerful woman in her designer suit, surrounded by all the trappings of success that money could buy. He had expected many things when he walked into this building. Lawyers, maybe. Threats. Some attempt to use wealth and power to simply take what he had spent 8 years protecting. He had not expected grief. He had not expected a mother who had clearly been broken by her own choices and someone else's betrayal. "I spent a lot of years angry," he said quietly. "Angry at whoever left her in that box. Angry at a world that could throw away something so precious. I imagined the kind of monster who could do that to a baby. I built a whole story in my head about someone cruel and heartless and unforgivable." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "But that's not what I see. Looking at you right now, that's not what I see at all." "What do you see?" The question was barely audible, but Marcus heard it. "I see someone who's been carrying something heavy for a long time, someone who's been searching, someone who made a mistake when she was young and scared and then spent almost a decade paying for it." Vivian let out a breath that seemed to release years of tension. "I'm not a monster." "No, you're not. I loved her. I still love her. Every single day for 8 years I've loved a daughter I held for 11 minutes. I believe you." The simplicity of his acceptance undid her completely. She sank into one of the leather conference chairs, her corporate composure utterly abandoned, her face buried in her hands as sobs shook her shoulders. Marcus didn't move. He didn't offer comfort, exactly, but he also didn't turn away. He let her grieve, let her release whatever had been building inside her for 8 years, because he understood that some wounds need to be opened before they can finally heal. When her tears finally slowed, when her breathing steadied enough for words, she looked up at him with an expression that carried desperation and hope in equal measure. "What happens now? I don't know what I'm allowed to want. I don't know what I have the right to ask for. She's yours. You raised her. You saved her life and gave her everything I should have given her. I have no claim on her except blood, and blood is the least of what matters." Marcus considered this. Considered the woman across from him, stripped of her power and her defenses. Considered the child waiting in the lobby, the daughter who had given his life purpose and meaning. Considered the impossible situation they had somehow stumbled into. "Grace deserves the truth," he said finally. "She's always known part of her story. She knows I found her. She knows someone gave her up. She's asked questions and I've always answered as honestly as I could." "What did you tell her?" "That I don't know who her first parents were. That somewhere out there someone might be missing her. And that it doesn't matter because she's my daughter now and nothing will ever change that." Vivian nodded slowly. "And what does she say?" Despite everything, Marcus smiled. "She says that's okay. She says whoever gave her up must have known I needed her. She says maybe they were just making sure she got to the right place." More tears spilled down Vivian's face, but these were different. Softer, somehow. The tears of a mother hearing for the first time that her daughter didn't hate her. She sounds remarkable. She is. She's the smartest kid I've ever met. She reads books way above her grade level. She asks questions that keep me up at night trying to find answers good enough for her. She's got a laugh that sounds like music and a temper that could start fires. She loves pancakes with too much syrup and hates the color orange, and she's the best thing that ever happened to me. I can see that, Vivian whispered. I can see how much you love her. More than anything. Then you understand why I need to ask, even though I have no right. Can I be part of her life? Not to replace you, not to confuse her or upend everything she knows, just to be there, to know her, to have a chance to love her in whatever way she'll let me. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and complications and 100 different ways the future could unfold. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful but not unkind. I've spent 8 years protecting her, from the system, from poverty, from anyone who might try to take her away. That protective instinct, it doesn't just turn off because you showed up with tears and explanations. I understand. But I also believe that Grace deserves to know where she comes from. All of it. The good parts and the hard parts. I never wanted to be the reason she grew up with questions I could have answered. So what are you saying? Marcus met her eyes directly. I'm saying we take this slow. We get a DNA test to confirm what we're both already pretty sure of. We figure out how to tell Grace in a way that doesn't overwhelm her. And then we let her decide, at her pace, on her terms. We don't make this about what we need. We make it about what she's ready for. And if she doesn't want to know me, then we respect that. You don't get to just show up after 8 years and expect a relationship. You have to earn it, just like I earned being her father. It was blunt. It was honest. It was exactly what Vivian needed to hear. Okay, she said quietly. However you want to do this, whatever pace you set, I'll follow your lead. I don't need you to follow, I need you to partner. This isn't about power or control. It's about a little girl who deserves all the love she can get. If you're serious about being in her life, then we figure this out together, not as opponents, as something else. Co-parents? Marcus almost smiled. Something like that. I've never exactly had a model for this situation. Neither have I. Then I guess we're both learning. They sat in silence for a moment, two people from opposite ends of the world, finding common ground in the space between their differences. The city sprawled below them. The afternoon light softened toward evening. And somewhere in the lobby, a little girl drew pictures with borrowed crayons, unaware that her entire future was being reshaped by adults who loved her. There's something else, Marcus said finally. What? I need you to understand something about how I see this, about what she means to me. Grace isn't a prize to be won or a possession to be claimed. She's a person, a whole, complete, remarkable person who happened to come into my life through circumstances neither of us chose. I've never thought of myself as her rescuer or her owner. I've always thought of myself as the lucky one, the one who got to be chosen by her. Vivian nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're asking if I see her as something I lost and want to reclaim. I'm asking if you see her as a person or as a solution to your grief. The question was sharp, but necessary, and Vivian took time to consider it honestly before answering. I spent 8 years grieving what I lost, she admitted. But standing here now, learning what she's been through, what you've built with her, I realized that my grief was always incomplete. I was mourning a possibility, not a person. I didn't know who she was. I only knew who she might have been. And now I want to know who she actually is. Not who I imagined, not who I hoped for, the real Grace, the one who loves pancakes with too much syrup and hates the color orange, the one who paints pictures about love-making families. That's the person I want to know, not some fantasy I've been carrying around for 8 years. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, then let's do this right. The DNA test confirmed what both of them already knew. Grace was Vivian's biological daughter. The same amber eyes, the same genetic markers, the same blood flowing through both their veins, connecting them in a way that science could measure but couldn't fully explain. But the test couldn't measure what Marcus had built through countless small moments of devotion. It couldn't quantify the trust Grace placed in him, the security of his presence, the father-daughter bond forged through years of sacrifice and unwavering love. So they did something radical. They chose collaboration over conflict. Vivian didn't demand custody. She didn't deploy lawyers or leverage her wealth or attempt to destabilize the only family Grace had ever known. Instead, she asked for permission permission to be present, to be known, to become part of Grace's story without erasing the chapters that came before. Marcus didn't retreat into defensiveness or view Vivian as a threat. He recognized the genuine anguish of a woman who had been deceived, who had never stopped searching, who wanted nothing more than the chance to know her daughter. Together, they agreed on the most important thing. Grace's well-being came first, before Vivian's desire to reconnect, before Marcus's instinct to protect, before any legal claims or biological imperatives. The child at the center of all this would be the one to set the pace. Telling Grace was the hardest conversation either of them had ever navigated. They did it together, seated in Marcus's modest living room. The second-hand furniture looked a little shabbier than usual, with Vivian perched on the edge of the worn couch, her designer clothes incongruous against the patched cushions. But she didn't seem to notice. Her attention was entirely focused on the little girl sitting between her father's knees, those amber eyes moving back and forth between the adults with an intensity that seemed far too mature for her age. "Grace, sweetheart," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest. "There's something we need to tell you, something important." "Is it bad?" "No, baby, it's not bad, it's just big and complicated, and we wanted to make sure you heard it from us instead of from someone else." Grace nodded slowly, her small face serious. "Okay." Marcus took a breath. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. And then together, in words chosen carefully to tell the truth without causing harm, they told her everything. They told her about the January night and the cardboard box, about Helena's betrayal and Vivian's search, about the 11 minutes and the 8 years, and the incredible coincidence that had brought them all to this moment. Grace listened with those remarkable amber eyes, processing information that would have overwhelmed most adults. When they finished, when the silence had stretched long enough for the words to settle, she asked the questions that neither adult had fully prepared for. "So you're my birth mother, like the one who had me in her tummy?" Vivian's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, sweetheart. But you didn't want to leave me in that box?" The question hit like a physical blow. Vivian felt tears threatening again, but she forced herself to answer clearly, needing Grace to understand. "No, God, no. I was lied to by someone I trusted. I thought you were going to a good family. I never knew what really happened until today, and I've spent 8 years looking for you. I never stopped, not ever." Grace considered this with the devastating seriousness that only children can truly muster. Then she turned to Marcus. "Daddy, did you know about her?" "Not until that day at the tower, but I always told you the truth about what I knew, didn't I? You said you found me. You said you didn't know who left me there. You said it didn't matter because I was yours now." "That's right, baby, and you're my daughter. Nothing changes that. Nothing ever will." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Her small hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress. Her brow furrowed in the same way Vivian's did when she was working through a complicated problem. Then, with the devastating simplicity that children possess, she asked the question that would define everything that followed. "So now I have 2 parents who wanted me instead of 0? The tears came. From both adults, streams of relief and joy and something like wonder, because somehow this child had cut through all the complexity and found the heart of the matter in a single sentence. "Yeah, baby girl," Marcus managed, his voice rough with emotion. "That's exactly what it means." Grace nodded slowly. Then she looked at Vivian with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming, just curious. The way you might look at a new neighbor or a potential friend. "So what do I call you?" Vivian felt her heart stop. "What do you want to call me?" "I don't know. I already have a daddy. Can I have 2 people? Is that allowed?" "Sweetheart, you can have as many people who love you as want to be in your life. There's no limit. Love doesn't work like that. It doesn't run out." "Okay." Grace seemed to accept this with the pragmatism of childhood. Then, unexpectedly, a smile crossed her face. "Does this mean I get more birthday presents?" The tension shattered into laughter. Marcus pulled Grace into a hug, while Vivian laughed through her tears, and for a moment, the weight that had been pressing down on all of them lifted just enough to let in hope. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about their situation was easy. But somehow, in the space of a single afternoon, 3 people who should have been adversaries had found a way to become something else entirely. Not quite a family, not yet. But something that might, with time and care and patience, grow into one. What followed was measured in months and then years. Small steps forward, occasional steps back, and the constant navigation of a relationship that had no roadmap and no precedent. Grace stayed with Marcus. That was never in question. He was her father, her constant, her home. The apartment might be small and the furniture might be secondhand, but the love that filled those rooms was real and deep and irreplaceable. Vivian became a presence, not sudden or overwhelming, but steady and consistent. She asked before she arrived. She called before she visited. She learned to fit herself into the edges of Grace's life without trying to push Marcus out of the center. There were weekend visits and homework help and Saturday mornings at the park. There were birthday parties where Vivian stood awkwardly with the other parents, unsure of her place, but showing up anyway because showing up was the only way to earn a place. There were difficult moments, plenty of them. Grace was a child processing complicated emotions, and sometimes those emotions came out sideways. She went through a period of angry outbursts, demanding to know why Vivian hadn't tried harder to find her. She went through a period of testing Marcus, checking whether his love was really unconditional or whether the biological mother would somehow replace him. Both adults weathered these storms with patience and honesty. They made mistakes. They apologized for them. They learned that healing wasn't a straight line but a winding path with plenty of detours. But slowly, incrementally, something beautiful began to emerge. Grace started introducing Vivian to friends, not as her mother exactly, but as someone important, someone who mattered, someone who belonged in the constellation of people who made up her world. Marcus and Vivian developed their own rhythm. They weren't friends exactly. They weren't Xio parents in the traditional sense. They were something new, something without a name, two people bound together by their love for the same child and their commitment to her well-being. Vivian used her resources thoughtfully, not to buy affection but to open doors. She established the Grace Initiative, a foundation dedicated to reforming adoption systems and supporting families formed through unconventional circumstances. The first major grants went to organizations working to prevent infant abandonment, providing resources and support to mothers in crisis so that no one else would ever have to make the choice she had made. Every child deserves to be found by someone who will fight for them, Vivian said at the foundation's launch, her voice steady and sure in a way it hadn't been since that day in the boardroom. I was lucky enough to have someone find my daughter when I couldn't. Now I want to help create a world where that kind of chance isn't left to chance. Marcus sat in the audience with Grace, watching Vivian speak with an eloquence that came from pain transformed into purpose. Beside him, his daughter beamed with a pride that spanned both her families. Marcus himself began to change too. With Vivian's quiet support, he enrolled in night classes, business management, the field he had dreamed of pursuing before life had forced him into survival mode. It wasn't charity, it was partnership. Vivian made sure he understood the difference. He graduated 3 years later with honors. Grace sat in the front row of the ceremony, cheering louder than anyone else, while Vivian applauded from a seat nearby, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. The years continued to pass. Grace turned 10, 12, 14. She grew taller and more confident with each passing season. She inherited her father's quiet dignity and her mother's fierce intelligence. She had Marcus's patience and Vivian's determination. She was the best of both of them, shaped by two different kinds of love that had somehow learned to exist in harmony. On Grace's 16th birthday, they gathered at a beach house that Vivian had purchased. Not for herself, for all three of them. A neutral space where the unconventional family they had become could make memories without any ghosts attached. Grace stood at the water's edge as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. She was tall now, nearly as tall as Marcus, with the confident posture of a young woman who knew exactly who she was. The amber eyes she had inherited from Vivian held Marcus's steadfast warmth. The intelligence was there certainly, but so was a kindness that transcended genetics. Marcus and Vivian walked down to join her, their footsteps leaving parallel trails in the wet sand. "I've been thinking," Grace said, not turning around, her eyes fixed on the line where sky met water, "about what I want to do after high school." "College, we hope," Marcus said mildly, "though I hear circus school is very competitive these days." Grace rolled her eyes with practiced teenage disdain, but she was smiling. "I want to study social work, maybe law eventually. I want to help kids who are stuck in systems that aren't built for them. Kids who are waiting for someone to fight." Vivian felt her heart swell with something that might have been pride, or hope, or simply the overwhelming gratitude of standing beside a daughter she had never expected to know. "Your great-grandmother, my grandmother," Vivian said quietly, Used to say that our choices matter more than our circumstances. I didn't understand that. For a long time, I thought circumstances were everything, that the hand we're dealt determines who we become. But you, she looked at Grace with wonder, you've taught me that's not true. You took the worst possible beginning and became someone extraordinary, not because of your DNA or your disadvantages, because of who you chose to be. Grace smiled, that radiant expression that could still light up any room. I had help. I had a dad who never gave up on me, even when giving up would have been easier, and I had a mother who spent 8 years searching, even when she had every reason to stop. She reached out and took both their hands, drawing them into a triangle of connection that would have seemed impossible on that day in the conference room when a question hung unanswered in the air. You know what I've learned from both of you? That love isn't about ownership. It's about showing up. It's about choosing someone over and over again, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, even when the world says you don't have the right. Marcus felt his eyes burning with tears he no longer bothered to hide. Vivian made no attempt to maintain her usual composure. You asked why I look like you, Grace continued, addressing Vivian with a gentle smile. But that's never been the important question. The important question is why a man with nothing found a baby with no one and decided she was worth everything he had. That's the miracle. That's the story. She squeezed their hands once more. I'm not yours because of biology or paperwork or some twist of fate that brought us back together. I'm yours because you both chose me, and I choose you too, both of you, forever. The sun set over the water in ribbons of orange and gold, painting the sky in colors that seemed designed specifically for this moment. 3 people stood together at the edge of the world, bound not by blood alone but by something stronger. The accumulated weight of choices made, in courage, of love offered without guarantee, of second chances that should have been impossible but somehow weren't. Behind them lay 8 years of searching, of sacrifice, of separate sorrows that had finally found their way toward healing. Before them stretched a future none of them could have imagined on that cold January night when a man had heard a cry in the darkness and made a choice that would change everything. Because in the end, family isn't determined by circumstance. It's built by intention, sustained by commitment, proven through the 1,000 small moments when giving up would be easier than holding on. And sometimes, the universe arranges for lost things to be found by exactly the people who need them most, not through luck or accident, but through the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of one human being reaching toward another and refusing to let go. That's what happened in a conference room 32 floors above the city, when a CEO asked a question she was afraid to answer, and a single father gave her the only truth that ever mattered. Not biology, not ownership, love. Simply, fiercely, unconditionally, love. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that family is something you build with your heart and not just something you're born into, let me know. Hit that like button so this story can reach more people who need it. Comment the word family if you believe love is what makes us belong to each other. And if you want more stories like this, stories that remind you of the best in people, hit subscribe and that notification bell so you never miss another one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for second chances. Because in the end, the CEO's question did change everything. Not by exposing secrets, but by proving that the smallest acts of love can echo the loudest. Until next time, keep believing in second chances, and keep choosing love. This has been Mr. Andy Love Stories.